A biting wind howled through the city streets, weaving through the alleys like an invisible predator. It was one of the coldest nights of the year, a night where even those with thick coats and heated homes shivered at the thought of stepping outside. But for those who had no shelter, who only had the concrete as their bed and the stars as their roof, this night was more than just cold. It was deadly. Wrapped in a tattered blanket, his fingers numb despite being buried inside its frayed edges, Martin sat against the brick wall of an abandoned shop. His beard, overgrown and unkempt, was speckled with tiny frost particles. He had lived on the streets for years, long enough to know how to survive the winter, find a sheltered spot, layer whatever clothing he could scavenge, and hold on to his one saving grace, the old wool blanket he had been using for the past 2 winters. But just a few feet away, huddled against a bench, was a sight that twisted his gut. A child, no older than 6 or 7, trembling violently. The boy wore only a thin hoodie and jeans, his lips turning an unnatural shade of blue. Martin's instincts screamed at him to look away. He knew the rule of the streets: survival first. He had already seen what happened to those who tried to help others when they barely had anything themselves. The world wasn't kind to people like him. And yet, his body betrayed his mind. Without thinking, he stood up, shaking off the snowflakes that had settled on him, and walked toward the boy. "Hey, kid," he muttered, kneeling down. The boy didn't respond. His eyes, wide and full of fear, darted toward Martin before quickly looking away. Martin sighed. Carefully, he peeled the blanket off his shoulders, the sharp cold biting into his skin almost instantly. "Take this," he said, draping the blanket over the boy's small frame. "It'll help." The child hesitated, but instinctively pulled the blanket tighter around himself, sinking into its warmth. Martin watched him for a moment, then backed away, stuffing his hands under his arms for warmth. He had done the right thing. He knew it. But as the freezing wind clawed at him, he also knew one thing for sure. This night was going to be brutal. The city had never been kind to Martin. Once upon a time, he had a home, a job, and even a family. But life had a cruel way of taking everything away in the blink of an eye. It started with losing his job. Cutbacks at the factory had left him unemployed, and despite his best efforts, he struggled to find work again. Bills piled up, rent went unpaid, and before he knew it, he was evicted. With nowhere to turn, he tried shelters, but they were always overcrowded. He learned quickly that the streets followed their own set of rules. Trust no one. Watch your back. And most of all, never show weakness. For years, Martin had done what he had to do to survive. He collected scraps from dumpsters, relied on the kindness of strangers for a meal here and there, and found solace in places where the city's glow barely reached. His one possession, the old wool blanket, had been given to him by an elderly woman outside a cafe 2 years ago. It wasn't much, but on nights like this, it was the only thing keeping him from freezing to death. But now, that blanket belonged to the boy. Martin sat back against the cold brick wall, his breath visible in the frigid air. His thin coat provided little protection against the cold, and his body shuddered involuntarily. He tried to keep himself warm by rubbing his arms, but the chill had already seeped into his bones. The boy, on the other hand, was still shaking, but not as violently as before. He clutched the blanket tightly, his tiny hands gripping the fabric as if afraid it might disappear. Martin sighed. "What's your name, kid?" he asked. The boy hesitated before whispering, "Ethan." Martin nodded. "Where's your family?" Ethan didn't answer right away. He lowered his gaze, avoiding eye contact. I don't know." Martin exhaled slowly. He had seen it before. Kids abandoned by desperate parents, lost in a system that didn't care. But it wasn't his place to ask questions. All he knew was that this boy needed help. He glanced around the empty streets. It was late, and most people had already gone home. The shops were closed, the sidewalks deserted. If someone didn't step in, the boy might not make it through the night. Martin sighed again and scooted a little closer to Ethan. "All right, listen," he said. "You stay under that blanket. Keep it wrapped tight. The cold's nasty tonight." Ethan nodded, his small body still trembling. Martin leaned his head back and stared at the sky. The stars were barely visible, hidden behind the thick, gray clouds. It was going to be a long night. The city remained eerily silent as the night deepened. Occasionally, the distant sound of a car passing by or the faint chatter of late-night wanderers echoed through the empty streets. Martin kept his arms crossed, doing his best to preserve whatever body heat he had left. The cold gnawed at him, but he refused to take the blanket back. Ethan needed it more. The boy's small body trembled less now, his breathing becoming steadier. Martin watched as his eyes drooped heavily, exhaustion pulling him into sleep despite the harsh conditions. Martin exhaled, turning his gaze back to the deserted road. He knew he should have walked away. This wasn't his problem. He had spent years learning not to care, because caring only led to heartbreak. But here he was, sitting next to a child who had nothing and no one. Maybe, in a way, he saw himself in Ethan. Martin pulled his knees closer to his chest, hugging them tightly. The cold made his bones ache, but he forced himself to endure it. He had survived worse nights. Suddenly, Ethan stirred beside him, blinking awake with a shiver. "I'm thirsty," he mumbled, his voice hoarse. Martin frowned. He didn't have anything to give the boy. "I'll see what I can do," he said, rising stiffly to his feet. A few blocks away, there was a 24-hour convenience store. Martin had no money, but sometimes, if he was lucky, the cashier on the night shift would let him take a bottle of water if no one was watching. It was a risk, but the kid needed something. He looked down at Ethan. "Stay here. I'll be right back." Ethan clutched the blanket tighter. "You promise?" Martin hesitated before nodding. "Yeah, I promise." He turned and walked briskly down the street. The cold bit at his exposed skin, but he ignored it, his focus on the store ahead. As he approached, he checked through the window. Bad luck. It wasn't the usual cashier tonight. This one looked grumpy, the kind that wouldn't spare a second glance before throwing him out. Martin bit the inside of his cheek. He could ask, beg even, but people weren't always kind, and tonight, he wasn't in the mood for another rejection. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he spotted a vending machine near the bus stop across the street. It wasn't much, but it sold bottled water. His fingers instinctively reached into his pockets, though he knew they were empty. "Damn it," he muttered under his breath. Just as he was about to turn away, he heard the soft jingle of coins hitting the pavement. Martin's head snapped toward the vending machine. A man in a suit had just used it, and, in his rush, had unknowingly dropped some spare change while grabbing his drink. The man walked away without noticing. Martin hesitated. It wasn't stealing, was it? The man had dropped it, and he wasn't coming back for it. Glancing around to make sure no one was watching, Martin quickly bent down, grabbed the coins, and counted them in his palm. Just enough for a bottle of water. Without wasting another second, he slid the coins into the machine, pressed the button, and grabbed the cold bottle as it dropped. Clutching it tightly, he hurried back to Ethan. The boy was still there, huddled under the blanket, his eyes wide with worry. "I got it," Martin said, handing him the bottle. Ethan's face lit up with gratitude. "Thank you." He twisted the cap open with small, frozen fingers and took a few sips before pressing the bottle to his lips again. Martin watched him drink, a strange warmth spreading in his chest. It had been a long time since he had felt like he had done something meaningful. As Ethan finished drinking, he yawned and rubbed his eyes. "Are you going to leave?" he asked quietly. Martin looked at him for a long moment. "No," he finally said. "I'll stay." Ethan nodded sleepily, curling deeper into the blanket. Within minutes, he was fast asleep again. Martin leaned his head back against the brick wall, exhaling slowly. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring. But for now, at least, the kid wasn't alone. Martin barely slept that night. The biting cold made it impossible to get comfortable, and every time he closed his eyes, his ears remained alert for any possible danger. The streets weren't kind to people like him, and having Ethan beside him only heightened his awareness. As dawn broke, the city began to stir. The distant hum of traffic, the soft chatter of early commuters, and the distant honking of impatient drivers filled the air. Martin shifted slightly, wincing as the stiffness in his limbs protested. Beside him, Ethan was still fast asleep, his small body wrapped tightly in the blanket. The sight made something tighten in Martin's chest. He needed to figure out what to do next. He couldn't just leave the kid here, but he also had no idea where to take him. Before he could think further, a loud voice interrupted his thoughts. "Hey, you two." Martin's head snapped up. A man in a security uniform was walking toward them, his expression a mix of authority and annoyance. "You can't stay here," the guard barked. "Move along." Martin tensed. He had dealt with security guards plenty of times before. They never cared about his circumstances, only about clearing the area. Ethan stirred at the noise, rubbing his eyes groggily. "What's happening?" he mumbled. Martin placed a protective hand on the boy's shoulder. "We were just leaving." "Good," the guard said gruffly. "This isn't a shelter." Martin stood, helping Ethan to his feet. The boy clutched the blanket around him, his small hands trembling from the cold. As they started walking away, Ethan looked up at him. "Where are we going?" Martin sighed. "I don't know yet, kid." His mind raced. He needed food for Ethan, maybe some warmer clothes. But without money, that was impossible. Then, as they turned the corner, something unexpected happened. A woman stood a few feet away, staring at them with wide eyes. She was dressed in a thick coat, her scarf wrapped tightly around her neck. But it wasn't her appearance that caught Martin's attention. It was the camera hanging around her neck. A journalist. Martin stiffened, his instincts screaming at him to keep walking. He had dealt with reporters before, the kind who thought they could turn his pain into some inspiring story for their own gain. But before he could move, the woman stepped closer. "I saw what you did last night," she said, her voice gentle. Martin froze. "What?" The woman smiled slightly. "I was across the street, getting photos of the city at night. I saw you give your blanket to the boy. I saw you go out of your way to get him water." Ethan looked up at Martin, confused. I just did what anyone would do," Martin muttered, feeling uncomfortable under her gaze. The woman shook her head. "No, not anyone. A lot of people would have walked away." Martin didn't know what to say to that. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small notebook. "I'm a journalist," she explained. "I work for the local paper. Your act of kindness, it's something people need to hear about." Martin tensed. "I don't want to be in the news." She hesitated. "I understand, but I think your story could make a difference." Ethan clutched Martin's hand. "Maybe she can help us," he whispered. Martin looked at the boy. Ethan's eyes were filled with hope, something he hadn't seen in them before. Martin sighed. "Fine, but no twisting the story." The journalist smiled. "I promise." She pulled out her phone and took a quick photo of Martin and Ethan, then started asking questions. By the time she was done, she handed Martin a card. "I'll make sure this story gets published, and I'll try to get you some help. Check in at this address later today. There might be something for you." Martin stared at the card in his hand, uncertain. He had spent years avoiding attention, but now, suddenly, he was in the spotlight, and he had no idea what that meant for him. Martin wasn't sure why, but he kept the journalist's card. Maybe it was Ethan's hopeful gaze, or maybe it was the small flicker of curiosity inside him. Either way, after hours of wandering the cold streets, he found himself standing outside the address she had given him. It was a small community center, its brick exterior weathered but welcoming. People bustled in and out, carrying bags of food, chatting warmly with volunteers. Martin hesitated. "I think we should go in," Ethan said, tugging at his hand. Martin exhaled sharply. "All right, kid. Let's see what this is about." Inside, the warmth was immediate. The scent of fresh coffee filled the air, and the sound of laughter echoed through the halls. Volunteers handed out meals, warm clothes, and supplies to those in need. A voice called out, "Martin, Ethan." The journalist from earlier hurried toward them, a smile on her face. "I'm so glad you came." Martin shifted uncomfortably. "You said there might be help." She nodded and gestured toward a tall man standing nearby. "This is David. He runs the center." David extended a hand. "Nice to meet you, Martin." Martin hesitated before shaking it. "We read your story this morning," David continued. "It's already making waves. People have been calling in, asking how they can help. Some even want to meet you." Martin frowned. "I didn't do anything special." David chuckled. "A lot of people disagree. Come on, let's get you two something warm to eat." They sat at a table, where steaming bowls of soup were placed in front of them. Ethan dug in eagerly, but Martin barely touched his. His mind was racing. David leaned forward. "I know accepting help isn't easy, but you and Ethan deserve a chance." Martin stared at the man. "I've been on my own for a long time. I don't know how to start over." David nodded. "That's why we're here. We can get you temporary housing, job training, and even legal assistance if you need it." Martin swallowed hard. It was overwhelming. The journalist chimed in. "People are talking about you, Martin. Your story reminded them that kindness still exists. That's why they want to help." For the first time in years, Martin felt something unfamiliar, hope. Ethan reached for his hand. "Can we stay here, Martin? Just for a little while." Martin looked at the boy's pleading eyes, then at David and the journalist. "Maybe, just maybe." This was the fresh start he never thought he'd get. Martin took a deep breath. The idea of starting over scared him, but looking at Ethan, he knew he couldn't let his fear stop him. "All right," he said finally. "We'll stay, at least for a little while." Ethan grinned and squeezed his hand. The journalist smiled warmly, and David gave him an encouraging nod. That night, for the first time in years, Martin and Ethan had a roof over their heads. They were given a small but comfortable room in the shelter with warm blankets and clean clothes. Ethan fell asleep almost immediately, but Martin lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Could he really change his life? The next morning, he got his answer. David introduced him to a caseworker who helped him fill out paperwork for temporary housing and job assistance. Meanwhile, Ethan was enrolled in a local community program where he could learn and play with other kids. As the days passed, Martin slowly began to adjust. The journalist kept in touch, giving him updates on how people were responding to his story. Donations poured into the shelter. People sent warm clothes, food, and even job offers. Then, one morning, a well-dressed man arrived at the center, asking for Martin. "I read your story," the man said, extending his hand. "My name is Greg Thompson. I own a construction company, and we're always looking for hard-working people." Martin hesitated. "I haven't worked in years." Greg smiled. "That doesn't mean you can't start again. If you're willing to learn, I'm willing to give you a chance." Martin glanced at Ethan, who was watching with hopeful eyes. "Okay," he said. "I'll do it." Within weeks, Martin was working again. The job was tough, but he didn't mind. Every evening, he returned to Ethan, exhausted but proud. For the first time in years, he felt like he had a purpose. One day, as he walked through the shelter, he noticed a new man sitting in the corner, shivering under a thin blanket. Martin paused. Without thinking, he took off his own jacket and draped it over the man's shoulders. The man looked up, surprised. Martin just smiled. "Stay warm." It was a simple act of kindness. But Martin now understood. Sometimes, the smallest gestures could change everything.